The main character fainted, but a young man managed to catch her quickly before she could hit the ground. He attempted to wake her up by checking on her well-being and asking if she was all right. Although her eyes remained closed, she muttered softly under her breath, saying that she was the villainess. At that exact moment, a rush of memories from her previous life suddenly returned to her. She pictured herself playing her favorite otome game, finishing different character paths and unlocking new pictures. She had been completely lost in that digital world when a strange voice echoed inside her mind. She remembered that she had been on the very last step needed to finish the route for the character named Hartknight, and she had felt immensely happy about collecting a new game image. She had even picked up her pre-ordered copy of the game with the intention of completing every single part of it to 100%. As these memories continued to flow, she understood clearly that these experiences belonged to her past life. Her face turned red, and she felt a wave of growing excitement in her thoughts as she wondered if she had actually been reborn into the world of that highly popular otome game, which was called the Ring of Lapis Lazuli. She observed her surroundings and carefully examined everything in sight. The entire scene perfectly matched an image from a game, featuring a very handsome man standing in the front with the other characters gathered behind him. The location was the Kingdom of Lapis Lazuli, the exact same game that she had loved so much in her previous life. Her heart began to race with excitement when she realized that she was actually inside the very world she used to play on a screen. Then, a blurry image of her own character started to form. It was clearly not the main heroine of the story. Once the picture became sharp and clear, it revealed her entire appearance. She possessed long and beautiful hair, but her facial expression looked very proud and snobby. Instead of the heroine, she was the rival character, the evil villainess. Her full name was revealed to be Tiararose Lapis Clementille, and she was the fiancée of the prince. This realization made her heart sink completely. She thought that if she had been born as the main heroine, everything would have naturally led to a happy ending. But that was simply not her role in this world. In her thoughts, she envisioned a massive castle standing far away with the town spread out right in front of it. Still feeling sad, she reflected on how incredibly powerful the heroine's charm was. The heroine was a girl who had transferred to the school located in the capital city. She lowered her head in deep disappointment, fully believing that this girl must be the true heroine of the game. The girl's name was Akari. In her mind, Tiararose started to calculate the years that had passed. She remembered that the girl had transferred to the school exactly 2 years ago. Suddenly, a shocking thought hit her, and she became deeply terrified because she realized that it was already much too late to fix anything. In her imagination, she dropped to the ground as she pictured the prince lifting his hand and declaring that their engagement was officially over. She calculated the current timing of the story and realized with horror that today was the day right before the graduation party, which served as the final event of the game. This meant there was absolutely no possible way for her to escape or avoid the exact moment where she would be publicly blamed and punished. The words appeared with perfect clarity in her mind, reminding her that being a villainess meant she was destined for a bad ending. When she finally opened her eyes, her very first thought was that she was trapped in the worst possible situation. She woke up lying on a small bed and quickly noticed that she was in the school infirmary. At first, she believed that she was completely alone in the room. However, a sudden voice broke the silence, informing her that she was finally awake, telling her that she should remain in bed, and mentioning that a carriage was already being prepared for her. Startled by the sudden noise, she quickly sat up in bed. In a state of total shock, she recognized the person speaking and called out his name as Sir Hartknights in her mind. Her heart began to beat so rapidly that she felt like she might faint all over again. The man standing there was the primary romance option of the game, named Hartknights Lapis Lazuli Lokomoth, who was the first prince of the Kingdom of Lapis Lazuli. The fictional character she had once controlled was now standing directly in front of her in real life. His full face came into clear view as he spoke, expressing his surprise at seeing her collapse like that since such a thing had never happened to her before. He wore a smirk on his face as he made the comment. She could only stare back at him with her eyes wide open in sheer disbelief. The young man continued speaking, suggesting that because he had been spending so much time with Akari, perhaps she had fainted just to make him pay attention to her. Tiararose froze instantly upon hearing this. The prince standing before her was completely different from the kind and devoted character she remembered from her past life playing the game. In that digital world, he had been entirely dedicated to her, and their story had even ended with a grand, beautiful wedding. She vividly recalled how the game Prince used to hold her gently, look into her eyes with pure love, and smile with true happiness during their wedding ceremony. Naturally, the person he had shown all that deep affection to was her, the player. However, the actual man in front of her right now did not feel like that sweet person at all. Instead, he felt genuinely frightening. She shook her head and quickly pushed the terrifying thought away, deciding it was best not to dwell on it. Thinking that she must simply be feeling unwell due to her faint, she slightly bowed her head and thanked him for showing concern. The prince replied in a very cold manner, stating that, in any case, she was still his official fiancée. As he looked down at her with clear disdain, a heavy wave of sadness washed over her. She realized it was completely useless to argue because, even at this very moment, he had already been completely won over by the main heroine. With her head still lowered, she began to think deeply about the heroine. She thought about how the name Akari sounded highly unusual for this world, noting that it seemed almost like a traditional Japanese name. Then, a sudden and shocking realization came to her mind. In the original game, Ring of Lapis Lazuli, the main heroine's name was never fixed from the start. It was actually a name that the player could freely choose for themselves. This caused her to wonder if Akari might also be a person from the real world who had been reborn into this game, just like her. However, her deep thoughts were suddenly interrupted by the sound of a cough. It was the prince clearing his throat. She flinched in surprise, suddenly remembering that she was not alone in the quiet infirmary. The prince slightly lowered his head and informed her that the school graduation party would be held the very next day, but he had another important engagement to attend. She turned her head to look directly at him. He offered a brief apology, explaining that he would not be able to escort her to the party as her partner. As they looked at each other, his freezing, cold eyes met hers directly. She responded very slowly, stating that she understood the situation perfectly and that she would simply attend the graduation party all by herself. Deep inside her mind, dark and painful thoughts began to appear. She knew that attending such a grand party without her fiancé standing beside her would be an extremely humiliating experience for a noble lady. The prince seemed genuinely surprised when she agreed to his unfair words so quickly and without any argument. Tiararose simply smiled gently at him and replied that it was certainly not her place to stand in his way or stop him from doing what he wanted. Hearing this, the prince raised his voice a little bit and pointed out that she would normally complain loudly about this, saying it was incredibly thoughtless of him to abandon his own fiancée. In the original game story, the character of Tiararose possessed a completely different, angry personality. The game version of her would have shouted out loud that his behavior made absolutely no sense and that the crown prince should be deeply ashamed of his actions. But now that she was actually living life as Tiararose herself, things were entirely different. An awkward, heavy silence quickly filled the entire room, and the prince looked at her with total confusion. Behind her perfectly calm and polite face, Tiararose was actually full of intense anger, which was quietly boiling deep inside her. She thought very bitterly to herself that the prince was only stating what was completely obvious. She wondered if he already knew he was being incredibly rude to her, and if this abandonment was some kind of deliberate revenge against her. Soon, a very sad and painful realization settled deep into her heart. She knew that tomorrow's terrible ending was already completely decided, and no matter what she chose to say right now, her words would no longer reach him or change his mind. The prince stood up from his spot and mentioned that her quick agreement made things much easier for him. Keeping her eyes completely closed, she simply answered in the affirmative. When he finally reached the doorway, he looked back at her one last time and repeated that he had an urgent engagement that he could not possibly avoid. She simply bowed her head politely and thanked him once again for his concern. A deep silence filled the infirmary once more as he left the room. Left entirely alone on the small bed, Tiararose let out a very quiet sigh of total defeat. She realized that if tomorrow's events followed the exact storyline of the game, then the prince and Akari would already be waiting together inside the venue by the time she arrived at the party alone. Immediately after her arrival, the terrible public condemnation event would begin. In the original game story, her character had been completely determined to confront the heroine directly and stop her from stealing the prince away. She vividly remembered Akari's perfectly innocent facial expression and how she herself had kept complaining bitterly over and over again. That exact jealous behavior was the reason she was going to be publicly judged and punished. She began to wonder how exactly the condemnation event would happen this time around. From what she could remember about the game's plot, her crimes did not actually seem too severe. She recalled that at a previous evening party, she had once raised her voice at Akari, sternly warning her that she must not dance more than twice with any man who was not her official fiancé. During that past event, Akari had looked deeply embarrassed, and the people standing nearby began whispering among themselves that she was shameless for touching another woman's future husband. Becoming very angry at the sight, Tiararose had shouted out loudly that the man already had an official fiancé. Back in the present moment, she thought about that day and felt that while her words may have sounded a bit too harsh, they were certainly not wrong. Those were simply the strict rules of high society that everyone was expected to follow. She told herself that there was absolutely nothing wrong with the daughter of a duke, who was also the heir of the highly respected Lapis family, giving a firm warning to the daughter of an earl. It would have been a completely different situation if their social ranks had been reversed. In her thoughts, the large castle stood far away in the distance, representing the immense power of the royal family. She remembered exactly how the unique ranking system of Lapis worked. It was a special honor given only to families who had served the crown greatly over many years, placing them just below the royal family in terms of status and influence. Since she was a small child, Tiararose had been raised with the sole purpose of becoming the next queen. Her private tutor had taught her strictly that she must never lower herself before people of a lower rank, and she was also taught that the crown prince must never behave carelessly in public. She remembered a specific moment from her past when she had begged the prince not to leave the palace secretly, but he had only laughed at her concerns and said that going into the common town should count as part of his social studies. Afterward, her father, who served as the kingdom's prime minister, had spoken to her strictly and told her that if her future husband continued to go down the wrong path, it was her personal responsibility to correct his behavior. Because of that heavy duty, she always acted as a proper and serious fiancée. She knew she might have been strict with him, but that was simply how she showed her genuine care for his future. She would always follow him around and remind him of what was right and wrong, but it seemed that he never truly understood her intentions. After being reborn as Tiararose, she realized that everything in her life would now change completely. She closed her eyes, lowered her head slightly, and let out a faint smile. Even if the prince had been her favorite character in her past life, it would not be proper for the daughter of a duke and the future heir of Lapis to act improperly by begging for his love. Tiararose shook her head strongly to stop herself from thinking about the past. She then thought that maybe she should simply not attend the graduation party tomorrow, but she quickly reminded herself that she could not hide away and cause terrible trouble for her kind parents. She thought again about what usually happened to a villainess who was publicly condemned at the end of a story. She suddenly remembered from the game's ending credits that Lady Tiararose would be banished from the kingdom. Realizing this fact, she lightly tapped her hand in surprise. That was exactly right. She would only be sent away into exile. With a small sigh of relief, she placed her hand over her beating chest and thought to herself that as long as the punishment was not death, she would be completely fine. Looking up, she began to cheerfully imagine her new future. She pictured herself living outside a small, cozy house and hanging her laundry to dry under the bright sunlight. She thought that maybe falling in love as a normal, everyday person could bring her true happiness. She reminded herself that she had also been a regular commoner in her past life, so she would easily be able to handle a simple lifestyle. Then she imagined the prince's face again, and she realized that if she had actually married him, her future might have been full of constant suffering. She told herself that the kind Hartknight she had loved so much from the game no longer existed in this reality. Lowering her gaze, she fully accepted that he was now a completely different person. As she looked at the passing clouds outside the window, she quietly wondered what would happen to her tomorrow. She was sitting silently in the room when she suddenly heard a polite knock on the door. A maid walked in and informed her that her carriage had finally arrived. As she sat inside the moving carriage, she closed her eyes and firmly decided that she would calmly accept the breaking of their engagement and leave the graduation party quietly without making a scene. While traveling back to her home, her thoughts briefly went back in time to a memory of her school days. She saw a busy classroom filled with many students. Some of them were talking happily with each other, some were studying hard at their desks, and others were just standing around in groups. From another person's point of view, Tiararose could be seen sitting all by herself, completely isolated from the rest of the class. The man who had been watching her in secret this whole time was Aquasteed Marine Forest, the crown prince of the neighboring kingdom. He looked at her very closely from afar and thought to himself that if he had just spoken to her back then, and if he had only reached out his hand to help her, then things might have turned out completely different for them both. Even though she seemed close enough for him to reach, his deep thoughts were suddenly broken by a very loud, crashing noise. This noise came from a chair that had tipped over and fallen to the floor when Tiararose stood up very suddenly. The entire room became completely quiet, and every person turned around to look at her with great worry. One of her classmates called out to her to ask if she was feeling all right. Tiararose's face had gone completely white, and she held her head tightly with her hands as her body started to shake and sway back and forth. Her fiancé, the prince, looked over at her and called out her name, but he did not get up from his seat or move at all to help her. Instead, it was the prince from the neighboring country who stood up quickly and walked over toward her side. Tiararose was breathing very hard, clearly having a difficult time, and her body lost its balance as if she were about to fall down to the floor at any second. Right at the exact moment she was about to hit the ground, Prince Aquasteed reached her just in time and caught her safely. While resting inside Prince Aquasteed's arms, she was completely unconscious, with her body covered in sweat and her eyes tightly closed. He looked extremely worried as he held her close, completely ignoring all the loud noises and talking around him. He picked her up fully into his arms and informed everyone in the room that he was going to carry her straight to the school infirmary. As he walked down the long hallway while carrying her, he felt very troubled and kept questioning himself about what could have gone wrong. He could not understand why a person like her, who was always very healthy and always worked hard to show a smile to others, would suddenly faint like this. He thought about how, as the official fiancée of the crown prince, she was always forced to deal with a large amount of stress and pressure. He thought that her fainting might be caused by that heavy stress, but then he changed his mind. He knew she was a very strong person and not someone who would break down easily, so that reason alone could not explain what had happened to her. Then, a picture appeared in his mind of a young girl who had long black hair and a very innocent smile. He began to wonder if the real cause of the trouble might actually be Akari. He had seen Akari many times before, smiling brightly while calling out to the prince and acting very close to him. She was a new transfer student who had quickly become very friendly with Prince Hartknight. Because of their close behavior, bad rumors had already started to spread around the school that the prince might leave his true fiancée, Tiararose, and choose Akari to be his wife instead. If those rumors turned out to be completely true, then absolutely nothing would stop him from asking Tiararose to marry him instead. He pictured himself kneeling down on one knee in front of her, gently holding her hand while she wore a beautiful dress, and asking her to become his wife. As the crown prince of Marine Forest, which was a country that was even bigger than the Kingdom of Lapis, he knew that all the official wedding arrangements could be finished very quickly if he wanted it to happen. When they finally arrived at the infirmary, he carefully laid her down on one of the beds. He gently guided her head onto the soft pillow while looking down at her face. In his mind, he firmly reminded himself that he would never ignore her personal wishes or force her to do anything that she did not want to do. He respected her deeply and admired her very much. He stayed inside the room for a short moment, quietly watching her sleeping face. After that, he stepped out of the room without making a sound and closed the door behind him, though he was still completely unable to fully understand his own true feelings. He admitted to himself that this was the very first time he had ever actually touched the person he cared about so much. He shook his head back and forth to clear his mind of these heavy thoughts and started to walk away down the hall. As he walked, he reminded himself that his life as a school student would soon come to a complete end with the graduation ceremony happening the very next day. He knew that most people believed feelings of love like this were only temporary and would simply disappear over time. Inside her bedroom, Tiararose let out a loud, heavy sigh. It had already been a full day since she had completely regained the memories of her past life, only to realize she had been reborn into the world of a game as the evil villainess. Today was the most critical day of all, the day of the school graduation party, which served as the absolute final event of the entire game story. Her personal lady-in-waiting, Flynn Sunfist, called out to her with deep concern in her voice. Flynn carefully asked her mistress if she was absolutely certain that she did not want to request her own father to escort her to the grand party. Tiararose shook her head gently and answered that she was completely sure about her decision. She explained to her maid that the king himself would also be attending the gathering, meaning her father would be far too busy handling his official duties as the royal counselor. She added that she simply did not want to cause any unnecessary trouble or burden for him. Flynn replied that even if that were true, arriving at such an important social party completely by herself would be an incredibly difficult and embarrassing experience for a young noblewoman. The maid paused for a moment before finishing her thought, wondering aloud if it would not be much more normal to ask another male relative for help when a lady lacked an official escort. Tiararose told her maid that everything would be perfectly fine, but then she honestly admitted that if her father were to see her arriving alone, he would undoubtedly become extremely angry. Flynn softly spoke her lady's name, looking deeply worried about the situation. She held her hands tightly together and admitted that she simply could not help but feel very anxious for her mistress. She gently reminded Tiararose that if there was anything at all troubling her mind, she could always talk about it openly with her. Hearing these sweet words, Tiararose felt quite surprised, but she smiled with deep gratitude and thanked Flynn. She expressed that it was truly enough for her just to know that Flynn was completely on her side. Deep within her own thoughts, Tiararose reminded herself that the terrible villainous condemnation event was about to begin very soon at the graduation party. She was suddenly pulled out of her dark thoughts when Flynn happily mentioned that she had prepared some delicious sweet treats to cheer her up. Tiararose smiled brightly and admitted that the kind gesture really did make her feel much better. Flynn smiled warmly in return and told her mistress that she was always more than welcome, adding that she had also prepared a fresh pot of hot tea. Tiararose reflected on how she had always deeply loved sweets during her past life, a trait that had not changed at all even after being reborn into this fantasy world. She knew that even when horrible things happened, delicious sweets always had a special way of making everything feel a little bit better, so she quietly hummed a happy tune while waiting for her tea to be poured. As Flynn carefully poured the hot tea into a cup, she thought to herself with a great deal of frustration about why the prince was refusing to escort Tiararose to the graduation party. The maid believed that he must have some sort of excuse, but even so, she simply could not bring herself to forgive his rude behavior. Her angry thoughts were directed entirely at Prince Hartknight. Their quiet and peaceful moment together was suddenly broken by a loud knock on the bedroom door. Tiararose called out to Flynn, who immediately walked over to the door and answered that she would open it to see who was there. While picking up one of the sweet treats, Tiararose wondered to herself if the visitor might be a messenger carrying a note from her school professor. She took a small bite of the treat and smiled happily, thoroughly enjoying the sweet taste. Just as she was about to reach for another sweet treat from the plate, someone suddenly shouted out her name with great urgency. It was Akari, who loudly asked if Tiararose was doing all right. Without even waiting for permission to enter, Akari pushed right into the private bedroom. Flynn tried her best to stop the uninvited guest, telling her firmly that she should not come into a noble lady's private room so suddenly. Flynn called out to her once again to halt, but Akari completely ignored the maid's protests and rushed straight toward Tiararose. Trying her best to remain calm and composed, Tiararose greeted Akari with polite manners and thanked her for showing concern. Akari smiled very warmly and asked Tiararose how she was feeling. As she closely observed Akari, Tiararose thought to herself that the girl's dress looked incredibly cute and luxurious. She noted that Akari looked as pretty as a pure angel, which was exactly what one would expect from the main heroine of a romance game. Akari explained that she had been terribly worried ever since Tiararose had suddenly collapsed inside the classroom the previous day. She beamed with absolute joy as she spoke, adding that Sir Hartknight had also been extremely worried about her health, praising him for being such a kind person. Tiararose smiled back at Akari and apologized for causing her so much worry. However, inside her own mind, she found it highly strange for Akari to call the prince kind for that reason, since Hartknight was her own fiancé and it was only natural for him to be concerned about her well-being. At that exact moment, a man walked directly into her private bedroom, and it was none other than Prince Hartknight himself. Tiararose immediately stood up from her spot and showed her perfect noble manners by giving him a proper curtsy and a formal greeting. Despite the fact that he had explicitly told her before that he would be unable to escort her to the graduation party, he had still shown up at her room anyway. What made it even worse was that he had actually brought another woman along with him. Showing such closeness right before the star event of the party was supposed to begin. Prince Hartknight explained that he had only visited because Akari had been deeply worried about her health. He then questioned whether she felt well enough to attend the graduation party that day. Meanwhile, Flynn stood quietly in the back of the room, directing a dark and highly displeased look toward the prince. Tiararose answered politely that she was doing perfectly fine because she had rested very well the previous night, so attending the event would not cause any problems at all. Inside her mind, however, Tiararose realized that the real reason for his visit was simply to make absolutely sure she would show up at the party. She noted to herself that although he always claimed to be far too busy with other things, he clearly had some free time after all, though she wisely kept these critical thoughts completely to herself. Akari cheerfully expressed her great relief that Tiararose was feeling much better, all while holding tightly onto the prince's arm, and the prince simply agreed with her words. Both Tiararose and Flynn watched the two of them with dark, serious expressions, noting silently that the prince and Akari were acting exactly like a romantic couple. Calling out to Flynn, Tiararose asked her how much time it would take to finish getting her ready and if they still had enough time left before the event. Flynn quickly understood the urgency of the situation and remarked that if they did not begin getting ready immediately, they would not be prepared in time for the party. Akari reacted with visible shock upon realizing that Tiararose had not even finished her preparations yet. Prince Hartknight then stood up from his spot, admitting that they had clearly arrived at a bad time, and decided that they should excuse themselves and leave. Tiararose bowed her head politely in response and apologized for rushing them out. At the same time, she thought to herself that the two of them were barely even trying to hide their romantic feelings for each other anymore. She also knew that if she failed to show up on time for the upcoming condemnation event, it would completely ruin all of their plans. Once the visitors had finally left, Flynn shut the heavy bedroom door firmly and turned toward her lady with clear anger. She questioned what the prince and Akari thought they were doing, stating that while the prince's behavior was bad enough, Akari had truly crossed the line as a guest. She pointed out that the prince's tie and Akari's hair ribbon were made from the exact same color and fabric. Slightly surprised by her maid's angry outburst, Tiararose thought to herself that Flynn had been paying incredibly close attention to the small details. Flynn continued to speak in deep frustration, questioning what the two of them could possibly have been thinking to act so closely right in front of Tiararose. Remaining perfectly calm, Tiararose reflected that although she had warned Akari about her behavior many times in the past, the girl simply had a bad habit of forgetting the rules. Flynn responded that it was highly unfortunate that Akari lacked any proper common sense, and she wondered why the prince never scolded her for it. The maid added that she could not bear the thought of letting her precious lady marry such an irresponsible man. The maid then boldly suggested that perhaps Tiararose should simply break off the royal engagement herself, since the entire situation was deeply disrespectful to her noble family. In her private thoughts, Tiararose acknowledged that Flynn had spoken the absolute truth, and that the engagement would undoubtedly be broken by the end of the day anyway. However, instead of saying those thoughts out loud, she gently reminded Flynn that it was highly disrespectful to speak about the royal family in such a negative way. Flynn smiled sheepishly and pointed out that the prince was not actually present in the room to hear her, which caused the two of them to share a quiet, gentle laugh. Tiararose smiled with deep gratitude at her loyal lady-in-waiting, feeling immensely relieved and happy that Flynn truly understood her feelings, and she silently offered her thanks. Flynn was somewhat taken back by her mistress's gentle words and could only repeat her lady's name in surprise. The maid had fully expected to be scolded as usual and told never to speak of such forbidden things again. Flynn began to wonder if perhaps her lady did not actually want this royal marriage after all, and she started brainstorming ways to make her mistress truly happy. As she considered her options, she thought about reporting the prince's disrespectful behavior directly to his father, the king. Raising her fist determinedly in the air, the maid declared that she would do her very best to help. Tiararose, feeling a bit confused by Flynn's sudden dramatic actions, gently advised her loyal maid not to overdo things. The scene then shifted to the grand party venue, where Tiararose stood directly outside the massive, closed doors. She remembered that in the original game story, her character had entered the room last of all. She had initially planned to avoid doing that this time, but every single guest had already gone inside ahead of her. She fully realized that the very moment those doors opened, her terrible condemnation event would officially begin. Noticing that her lady-in-waiting was trembling nervously beside her out of worry, Tiararose smiled gently at her, reassuring her that she was perfectly fine and promising that she would see her later. Flynn bowed her head respectfully in response, replying that she would wait faithfully until they met again. Taking a deep, steady breath and slowly letting it out, Tiararose gathered all her remaining courage and finally stepped inside the grand party room. As she crossed the threshold, an announcer loudly called out her full name to the entire crowd, stating that Tiararose Lapis Clementille had officially arrived. Immediately, every person in the room turned to look at her with expressions of deep concern. People began calling out her name in whispers and asking one another why she was walking into the venue completely alone without an escort. In the background of the room, standing closely together, were Akari and Prince Hartknight. Seeing them there, Tiararose knew that the terrible moment had finally begun. She thought to herself that she had not interacted with any of the other romance characters from the game during her time at school. Because of this, she found it very strange that they were all present in the room together, and she wondered if the situation was part of some new update to the game that she did not know about. As she took another step forward into the room, Prince Hartknight called out in a very loud, booming voice and declared to everyone present that he was officially breaking off his engagement with her. The entire crowd was instantly shocked by this sudden announcement, and many voices rose up in complete disbelief. People began questioning who the strange woman standing right beside the prince was and what terrible thing Tiararose could have possibly done to deserve such a punishment. Bowing her head politely toward the royal prince, Tiararose remained completely calm and softly asked to be allowed to know the exact reasons for his harsh decision. Hartknight responded to her request with clear irritation and told her that she should ask her own heart, stating that she could not possibly claim to be ignorant of her own actions. Tiararose replied directly that she truly did not understand what he meant, which seemed to surprise the prince a great deal. She firmly stated that she had absolutely nothing to be ashamed of in her past behavior, but she added that if the prince truly wished to make another woman his queen, then he should have made the proper and legal preparations beforehand. Hearing her calm words, Hartknight became incredibly angry and shouted her name out loud, accusing her of being extremely insolent for speaking back to the royal family in public. At that moment, Tiararose's father stepped forward from his position beside the king to defend his daughter, but she gently shook her head toward him to signal that everything was all right and that he should stay back. Placing his arm tightly around Akari's shoulder to comfort her, Hartknight claimed to the entire room that Tiararose had repeatedly made many mean remarks about Akari coming from the countryside. The prince then turned his head and asked Akari if she had been terribly frightened by these remarks. With tears swelling up in her eyes, Akari answered that she had indeed been very scared, but she added that she felt perfectly safe now because the prince was standing right there with her. Suddenly, another voice spoke up from the crowd, pointing out that a vast number of people lived outside the capital city, including the hardworking farmers and others whose daily labor supported the entire country, and that it was completely unforgivable for anyone to look down on them. This voice belonged to Cliff Island, who served as the commander of the Knights platoon. Tiararose thought to herself that looking down on commoners was absolutely not the real reason behind her past actions, but she still maintained her composure and told the prince once again that she did not understand his accusations. Hartknight became even more frustrated by her refusal to admit fault and stated that he had personally heard about the things Tiararose had said to Akari. He accused her of ordering Akari to kneel down in respect to him and explicitly forbidding the girl from dancing with him. Standing perfectly still in the middle of the room, Tiararose thought to herself that the version of Hartknight from the game had been much smarter than the real person standing before her now. She carefully explained to the angry prince that she had only said those things because he was the crown prince of the kingdom, meaning it was only natural for people to act with proper courtesy and show him the absolute highest level of respect. She pointed out that it was basic common sense that when a person met a member of the royal family for the very first time, they were supposed to kneel as a clear sign of great respect, and she had only warned Akari because the girl had completely failed to perform this basic duty. The prince nodded and said that he could understand that specific explanation, but he then demanded to know why she had strictly told Akari not to dance with him. Tiararose answered clearly that she had done so because Akari had already danced with him more than 2 times at a single event, and she expressed her disbelief that Hartknight himself did not know the serious meaning behind such an action. She went on to explain the strict rules of high society, stating that dancing with the same man twice traditionally meant that the 2 people were officially engaged, and the very first time a couple was ever allowed to dance together 3 times was after they had become husband and wife. Even as she explained these social rules, her mind trailed off into her past memories, remembering the exact moment when Akari had boldly asked Hartknight to dance and how the 2 of them had happily done so twice without any regard for her feelings. She then asked the prince if he truly understood how deeply humiliating that experience had been for her, and how his careless actions clearly showed everyone in high society that he favored Akari far more than his own official fiancé. She questioned him directly if he could really blame her for her protective behavior under those circumstances. Hartknight tried to argue back, claiming that Akari had always told him she was being viciously attacked, and that he simply could not believe Tiararose's words to the girl could have been anything but cold and mean. Hearing his stubborn reply, Tiararose asked him if he truly believed deep down in his heart that she was that kind of malicious person, realizing that he must have already decided she was guilty. She then stated a fact, explaining that she and Lady Akari had never once been completely alone together because there were always many other noble ladies present during their conversations. She asked the prince if he had bothered to look into that fact or interview the witnesses at all. The prince turned his head in surprise toward Akari and asked her if other people had really been present during those arguments. Akari found herself completely unable to answer his question at first, and she simply stood there looking incredibly awkward and guilty. After gathering her scattered thoughts, Akari stated that Tiararose's followers had also been present during those times, specifically naming Lady Fluran and Lady Marietta. Hearing the word followers used to describe noble ladies, the gathered crowd reacted with instant confusion, whispering among themselves that those women should be called her friends instead. The prince became clearly irritated by Akari's poor choice of words, leaving Akari with no choice but to awkwardly agree with his unspoken disapproval. Hearing this insult to her companions, Tiararose stated firmly that the people Akari had casually dismissed as followers were actually very important to her, and she requested that Akari refrain from speaking about them in such a disrespectful way. Secretly, she began to reflect deeply on the unfair accusation of being a vicious person. Meanwhile, the murmurs among the crowd grew even louder, with many guests openly questioning who was truly being cruel in this situation, muttering that the entire accusation made no sense and calling the prince's behavior a complete insult to high society. Tiararose then looked directly at the prince and asked if he truly wished to end their engagement solely because she had supposedly been cruel to Akari, and the prince firmly confirmed that this was his exact desire. Showing a sad smile, she explained to everyone that none of her past actions had ever been cruel, but she acknowledged that his heart already fully belonged to Akari anyway. Inside her own mind, she smiled faintly, thinking that perhaps her life would not have to end in the exact same tragic way as the game plot. She really did not mind if the royal engagement was broken, as long as there was no actual need for her to be banished from her home country. If things could just end quietly right here, it might turn out to be the most peaceful outcome for everyone involved. However, her hopeful thoughts were suddenly cut short when Prince Hartknight loudly declared that her explanations were simply not enough because Akari had still been deeply hurt by her words. He then formally announced the official breaking of his engagement with Tiararose to the entire room and proudly declared Akari as his brand new fiancée, making her the future queen of the kingdom. To make matters worse, he added that such a disrespectful attitude toward the future queen could never be forgiven. And with that final statement, he loudly proclaimed that Tiararose was officially banished from the kingdom forever. Tiararose stood frozen in complete shock, utterly unable to understand what he was saying, and she could not help but think to herself that the prince must be a complete idiot. Finally recovering a small amount of her composure, she tried to speak out, but she could only express her total disbelief through her expression. She glanced over at her father and noticed that he was on the absolute verge of losing his temper in front of the court, and she knew she had to quickly find a way to stop him from doing something dangerous. Before she could say a single word to her father, a powerful voice suddenly interrupted the tense silence of the room, commanding Hartknight to stop his foolish actions. The voice questioned whether the prince's own words were not far more cruel than anything Tiararose had ever said, before gently addressing Lady Tiararose directly. The speaker was revealed to be none other than Prince Aquasteed himself. Tiararose looked up at him in utter surprise as he softly reassured her to stay completely calm. Her nervous trembling stopped instantly as she realized that true help had arrived at the final, desperate moment, feeling almost like a magical scene straight out of fairy tale, and her heart began to race rapidly as she stared at him. Standing protectively right in front of her, Prince Aquasteed faced Hartknight with an incredibly cold and piercing gaze. Hartknight angrily snapped back at him, telling him that this entire situation was absolutely none of his business. However, Prince Aquasteed calmly and smoothly replied that he believed it was very much his business, an unexpected answer that Hartknight had absolutely not anticipated. Tiararose felt completely confused by this turn of events, thinking to herself that this incredible rescue had never happened anywhere in the original game, and she wondered with a mix of fear and excitement what would happen next. Prince Aquasteed then turned his body toward her, gently asking if she was now officially no longer engaged to the prince, and she gave him a quiet nod in response. Immediately after her confirmation, he openly asked Lady Tiararose to become his own queen, a shocking proposal that left every single person in the entire room completely speechless. Tiararose was completely unable to form any words, and she could only react with total disbelief, wondering exactly what the prince meant by his shocking statement. Aquasteed Marine Forest was the crown prince of a neighboring country called Marine Forest, and he had come to study at the Lapis Lazuli Academy for a duration of 1 year. In the original game, he had not been one of the available romance characters, but it had been announced before her death that he would appear as a main character in the game's sequel. The mere thought of a sequel to the Ring of Lapis Lazuli made her question everything around her in utter disbelief, as there had been no specific details released yet, only the visual reveal of his character design. When she had first seen his drawing in her past life, she had immediately become highly interested in him, because he was a crown prince from a very powerful country who possessed a gentle smile that seemed to hide a small trace of hidden darkness. She remembered thinking back then that he was incredibly handsome and that she could not wait to play his romantic route, but her previous life had unfortunately ended before the new game was ever released to the public. She had never once imagined that she would actually meet the real, living person in this manner. The specific words about becoming his queen echoed loudly inside her mind, leaving her deeply confused and unsure of reality. She questioned whether he had truly just proposed to her, completely unable to fully comprehend what was happening in front of her. She tried to convince herself that this whole situation must be nothing more than a strange dream, blushing intensely as she thought that when she finally woke up, she would return to her normal past life of playing romance games. However, Prince Aquasteed interrupted her swirling thoughts by stating that he knew she must be very surprised by his sudden and unexpected request, but he gently asked her to at least consider his offer. Hearing those genuine words made her realize that she had absolutely no resistance to his immense charm, noting that even Prince Hartknight had never treated her with such kindness and respect. In a complete panic, she looked over toward her father and saw him nodding his head in clear approval of the situation. Just moments ago, her father had been completely ready to explode with anger at the other prince, and now she did not know what she should do next. Looking back at Prince Aquasteed's gentle smile, her heart began to beat even faster than before, so she thanked him and expressed that his warm feelings made her feel very happy. Suddenly, a woman's loud voice interrupted their moment, telling them both to wait immediately. It was Akari who pointed out that Lady Tiararose had only just been Prince Hartknight's fiancée a few moments ago, and yet Prince Aquasteed was now asking her to become his own fiancée. She insisted out loud that there must surely be someone else who was far more suitable for a prince like him. Prince Hartknight looked at Akari in complete shock at her sudden, emotional reaction, while people in the surrounding crowd began whispering loudly among themselves, noticing how casually and rudely she spoke in front of royalty. Stomping forward with attitude, Akari approached Prince Aquasteed while he was still kneeling on the floor and tried to physically pull him up by his arm, saying that Lady Tiararose could be very blunt and urging the prince to come away with her instead. Seeing this shocking display of bad manners, Tiararose spoke up firmly, stating that this behavior was completely wrong. She pointed out that the man Akari was trying to drag away was Prince Aquasteed of Marine Forest, and he was absolutely not someone she could treat so casually or disrespectfully. She ordered Akari to reverse her actions and release him immediately, warning her that such severe disrespect could easily damage the peaceful relationship between their two kingdoms. Tiararose simply could not understand how Akari failed to realize something so basic about international politics. Prince Aquasteed then gently freed himself from Akari's tight grip and thanked Tiararose for her protective concern. Blushing from his close attention, she replied that it was really nothing at all and was about to continue speaking, but Akari suddenly interrupted her again by loudly calling out to Prince Aquasteed once more. Prince Aquasteed turned sharply toward Akari and stated coldly that he was the first prince of the kingdom of Marine Forest, before student-like sternly asking her if she still intended to act in such an improper way even after knowing exactly who he was. Akari reacted in total disbelief, saying that since he was known to be a kind prince, she believed he would not get angry at her. But before she could even finish her sentence, two royal soldiers suddenly approached her side. Still in a state of total shock, Akari was tightly restrained as one of the soldiers declared her behavior to be completely disrespectful to royalty and ordered that she be taken away from the venue immediately. Tiararose bowed her body deeply and offered a sincere apology to Prince Aquasteed, thinking to herself that simple words would never be enough to truly gain his forgiveness for the chaos. Prince Aquasteed told her to raise her head and reassured her that there was absolutely no reason for her to say she was sorry. He stated that if anyone needed to apologize, it was Prince Hartknight. Turning his eyes toward the other prince, he waited patiently until Prince Hartknight finally bowed his head and offered his own apology. Prince Aquasteed then answered that he would accept the apology, explaining that the situation happened because he had chosen to step in himself, which left Prince Hartknight feeling very confused. Prince Aquasteed then held both of Tiararose's hands in his own and gently told her that she should not look so worried or sad. She replied to him that everything was perfectly fine, expressing that he had helped her when she needed it, and that alone was more than enough. Deep inside her own thoughts, she believed that if he had not stepped in, nothing physically harmful would have happened to her, and her life simply would have followed the original game plot where she was sent away. Yet everything felt very different and strange now that she was living in the real world. Even so, she felt a sense of true happiness because someone had actually saved her from a terrible situation. In the background of the room, Akari continued to shout loudly and struggle against the guards, demanding that they let her go immediately. A powerful, loud voice suddenly ordered everyone to stop at once. It was the king himself who angrily asked Akari if she truly intended to bring even more shame and embarrassment to his country. Prince Hartknight called out to his father in deep worry. The king then turned and bowed his head toward Prince Aquasteed to express his deep regrets, stating that one of his own citizens had deeply insulted a royal guest. Without showing any fear of the king, Akari loudly insisted that if she had not stepped in to stop Lady Tiararose, something incredibly rude might have happened to Prince Aquasteed instead. Prince Aquasteed also bowed his body slightly toward the king and calmly explained that he was actually the one who had suddenly stepped into the middle of the situation first. The king expressed his true gratitude for the prince's kind understanding, but he openly admitted that the prince's sudden proposal of marriage to Lady Tiararose had come as a huge surprise to everyone. Prince Aquasteed replied that he firmly believed he would never get another chance like this if he chose to stay silent. He then turned his attention to both the king and Tiararose's father, Marquis Clementille, asking them both to officially allow him and Tiararose to become engaged to each other. The king thought silently about the request for a brief moment and stated that he found the idea to be very wonderful, as it would create a powerful and helpful bond between their two countries. He added that his own son carried a large amount of the blame for everything that had happened that night, and for that reason, the previous engagement between Prince Hartknight and Tiararose would be completely and legally cancelled. Prince Aquasteed thanked the king for his decision, and then turned to ask Marquis Clementille if he had any worries about his lack of experience. Tiararose's father answered that he had already heard many great things about Prince Aquasteed and fully believed that the prince would treat his daughter with great care and goodness. However, he honestly admitted that he had once felt the exact same way about Prince Hartknight, yet his daughter had just been deeply hurt by him anyway. As her loving father, he explained that he wanted to completely respect her own personal choice above everything else. The king looked over at her father with a look of worry, thinking heavily about how difficult it would be to refuse a serious proposal from a powerful royal family. Despite feeling very conflicted and unsure inside, Tiararose softly whispered to her father that turning down such a grand offer might be seen as highly disrespectful to their royal guest. Prince Aquasteed smiled warmly at the Marquis and praised him, calling him an absolutely perfect and ideal parent. He then stated that as soon as Tiararose had fully made up her own mind about the matter, he would visit the Marquis at his home again to finish the official arrangements. Tiararose could only repeat his name very softly in her own mind. Turning his body back toward her, Prince Aquasteed openly admitted that he might have moved far too quickly tonight, and then gently asked her if she would be willing to spend some time together with him at a later date. Tiararose smiled warmly at him and agreed to his request without any hesitation at all. In her private thoughts, she quietly told herself that he was incredibly kind, though she still wondered why a wonderful prince like him would feel such deep affection for a person who was supposed to be the evil villain. The king then turned to the entire crowd in the ballroom and loudly announced that he was very sorry for the dramatic way the evening had turned out. He strictly ordered Prince Hartknight to leave the party immediately and told the remaining guests to try and enjoy the rest of their hours together. Tiararose's father then came over to her and told her that she should return home to rest and leave every other complicated detail for him to handle, and she quietly nodded her head in agreement while smiling up at him. Prince Aquasteed gently took hold of her hand and asked if he could have the honor of escorting her out of the room, and she gave him a very short, polite reply of agreement. As they walked together toward the large exit door, Akari could be seen watching their departure completely helplessly from distance. Glancing up at the prince beside her, Tiararose thought to herself that she had successfully managed to avoid being banished from her home country, but something entirely unexpected had happened instead, because Prince Aquasteed had actually proposed to her. The major event had finally reached its conclusion, but she could not help but wonder what would happen next in her new life. The scene then shifted to the inside of a moving carriage that was traveling on the way back to her family home. Tiararose sat quietly and looked across at the prince, completely unable to think of anything proper to say to him. The very prince from the game's sequel, whom she had never been able to play in her past life, was now sitting right in front of her. Inside her mind, she questioned why she had to die before that new game was ever released to the public. She thought about how wonderful it would have been if only she had stayed alive long enough to see all his character details, feeling so incredibly happy about his presence that she felt like she could almost dance with joy. Yet, at the exact same time, she wondered deeply why a man like him would choose to propose to her when she was supposed to be the evil villainess of the story. She glanced up to look at his face again, but she found that he was already looking back at her with a warm smile. Realizing that he had caught her staring so closely, she became very embarrassed and quickly offered her apologies to him. Prince Aquasteed gently replied that he was looking at her simply because he wanted to do so, assuring her that there was absolutely no reason for her to apologize. He added that he actually felt deeply honored that she cared enough to look at him. Feeling incredibly shy, she tried her best to respond by mentioning that she already knew he was highly admired by a great many women at the academy. In a playful and teasing tone, the prince asked her if her words meant that he could hold a little bit of hope for her personal feelings. Thoroughly embarrassed by his teasing, she could only manage to give a very soft and quiet response while her heart beat incredibly quickly inside her chest. Gathering all of her remaining courage, she directly asked him the reason why he had chosen to propose to her. He answered simply that he had been quietly watching her for a very long time from the high library window, where she was always reading her books. Feeling a bit confused at first, she questioned what he meant by that statement, but then she suddenly remembered the quiet, secluded place located right behind the school library. She had spent hours reading under a large tree there, so that she would never become an embarrassment as a future queen, working hard to gain a very wide range of useful knowledge. At the same time, she really liked that she could secretly eat her favorite sweet treats while reading in that private spot. Prince Aquasteed happily confirmed that it was indeed that exact place. He then explained to her that all of her facial expressions would change beautifully depending on what she was reading, and he had found those natural reactions to be completely adorable to witness. Hearing this intimate detail, her entire face turned bright red with embarrassment. He continued to describe his memories, recalling how one moment she would look incredibly serious while reading a difficult passage, and the very next moment her cheeks would turn red with a highly shy expression. He even admitted to her that whenever she was moved to tears by a sad story, he had deeply wanted to hold her tightly in his arms, which made her feel even more embarrassed. Tiararose quickly begged him to please forget all about seeing her in those private moments, but he insisted that doing so was completely impossible for him. While gently taking hold of both her hands, he asked to see even more of her true self now that the two of them were finally together. She realized with a shock that someone had been quietly watching her this entire time and felt extremely self-conscious about her hidden habits. However, the prince confessed that he actually felt a bit guilty for observing her in secret like that, but seeing her red under that tree every single day had slowly drawn his heart toward her, which had surprised even himself. He then gently kissed the back of her soft hand and stated that everything he had just told her was the absolute truth. He added that because she had been Prince Hartknight's official fiancée, he could not simply step in and take her away from the local royal family without a proper reason. Tiararose could only look back at him in total disbelief at his honest confession. He explained that he had fully planned to endure those painful feelings in silence and return to his own home country after his year of study was finished, trying his best to forget all about her. That had been his original, sad intention, but the graduation party tonight had suddenly given him a very rare and unexpected chance, and he had been completely desperate not to lose that one perfect opportunity to save her. Tiararose could only softly speak his name in response, completely overwhelmed by his deep devotion. He then questioned his own behavior, pointing out that even though he was a crown prince who should focus on his country, he had fixed his eyes entirely on one woman and waited patiently for a single chance to take her away from her own fiancé, asking her if his actions did not make him a terrible person. Tiararose firmly confirmed to him that he was not a terrible person at all. She added that when she had been standing all alone in that crowded ballroom, facing public humiliation, the sudden presence of Prince Aquasteed had been the most comforting and reassuring thing in the world to her. Inside her mind, she reflected on how, even though she knew she was not in the wrong during the argument, she had still been incredibly nervous and filled with deep doubts about her future. She thought about the powerful voice that had stepped in to help her at that exact moment, remembering just how happy and encouraged she had felt because of it. She felt completely unable to express in words just how much Prince Aquasteed's voice had saved her from despair, and she blushed deeply as she thought about it, while the prince simply continued to stare at her with affection. The prince then inquired if she was still feeling worried about the evening's events, noting that the other girl at the party had certainly said quite a lot of hurtful things to her. Tiararose answered clearly that while the girl had spoken a lot, she was not worried about it at all, explaining that she was simply happy to be able to safely return to her family's mansion like this. While gently touching and holding her long hair, Prince Aquasteed acknowledged her feelings with a nod. He admitted that because Prince Hartknight had gone so far as to announce her total banishment from the kingdom, he had been quite surprised by the sheer severity of the situation. He then confessed to Tiararose that if the other prince truly wished to throw her out of the land, he thought it would be much better for him to simply run away with her and kidnap her himself, before pressing a soft kiss against her hair. Tiararose blushed a very bright red at his bold declaration and shyly begged him not to tease her in such a wild manner. However, Prince Aquasteed firmly stated in response that he was being completely serious about his words. Tiararose's heart began to beat very quickly as she thought about how incredibly embarrassing the entire situation was. She realized that Prince Aquasteed possessed a very intense and passionate type of character. Breaking her train of thought, Prince Aquasteed expressed his clear desire to take her out on a date and gently asked if she would be willing to make some free time in her schedule for him. Tiararose blushed deeply and agreed to his romantic invitation. Smiling warmly, she explained to him that since she had already officially graduated from the academy, she was no longer required to meet with her former fiancé for royal bridal training, meaning her schedule was completely open and she had plenty of time to spend with him. Prince Aquasteed became very happy upon hearing her positive answer and suggested that they go on their date exactly 3 days from that moment. Tiararose smiled again and replied that she would happily look forward to their upcoming meeting. He expressed his true gladness and informed her that he would personally come to pick her up at her family home on that designated day, asking her to wait faithfully for his arrival. Tiararose did not say any words in response to his request, choosing instead to simply smile back at him. Prince Aquasteed then softly remarked that he honestly did not believe he would ever get bored of looking at her beautiful face. While Tiararose turned her gaze to look outside the carriage window, her mind began to drift to serious worries about the future. She wondered to herself if there was actually no main heroine character in the game's upcoming sequel, as she questioned whether she and Prince Aquasteed could truly stay together forever. She worried deeply if he might eventually change his mind and leave her, just like Prince Hartknight had done. Prince Aquasteed quickly noticed that her thoughts were far away and gently called out her name to bring her back to reality. Startled by his voice, Tiararose realized that she still found it completely hard to believe that such a wonderful prince could view her so highly and favorably. Prince Aquasteed reached out and gently touched her face, playfully teasing her by saying that she doubted his true feelings far too much and calling her mean for being so suspicious of him. He then leaned his face very close to hers and softly whispered in her ear that because she was so incredibly adorable, he was completely unable to stop himself from liking her. Tiararose was too stunned to speak a single word. Her entire face turned a bright shade of red, and she weakly tried to argue against his claim of her being adorable, but she was completely unable to finish what she wanted to say. Before she could complete her sentence, Prince Aquasteed interrupted her to point out that they had officially arrived at their destination. Tiararose glanced outside the window and realized that the carriage was already parked directly outside her family's large house. She blushed intensely as she looked back at him, while Prince Aquasteed simply sat there, smiling warmly at her. A short moment later, they stepped out into the open air, and the prince carefully assisted her out of the vehicle by holding her hands gently. Once she walked inside her home, she leaned heavily against the soft cushions of a couch, feeling completely overwhelmed as she questioned why she felt so confined by such intense emotions, wondering what Prince Aquasteed was truly supposed to do in the original plot of the game. The very next day, Prince Hartknight walked up to a guard and ordered him to open the door to the room. The guard informed the prince that he had received strict orders directly from the king to refuse any and all visitors who tried to enter. Prince Hartknight tried to persuade the guard to let him pass, explaining that he would not take a long time inside and that he only wished to check on Akari's well-being. When the guard attempted to object and uphold his orders, the prince actually began to plead with him. He explained that perhaps he had made the entirely wrong decision the night before, and he needed to speak with Akari immediately to make absolutely sure of his feelings. The guard felt completely shocked that a royal prince would lower himself to plead with a regular soldier. In his private thoughts, the guard recalled the bad rumors going around that the prince had become a truly foolish man because of his deep involvement with this woman named Akari, but he did not dare say such a dangerous thing out loud. Instead, the soldier simply replied that he was glad the prince was thinking about the situation so carefully. Prince Hartknight continued to insist, asking the guard to just close his eyes for a mere 10 minutes. Finally, the guard gave in to the pressure, and the prince thanked him quickly before stepping into the room. Once inside the room, the prince saw Akari sitting down and reading a book. The moment she noticed his presence, she immediately became extremely excited, stood up from her spot, and called out his name happily. She approached him quickly and expressed how much she had wanted to see him, complaining bitterly that she had not been allowed to leave the room at all. She added that she had absolutely nothing to do in her confinement, to the point that she felt like she might actually die from pure boredom. When the prince remained completely silent and did not give an immediate response, she kept right on speaking. She stated that she had never expected Prince Aquasteed to say such shocking things to Lady Tiararose at the graduation party, and she openly hoped that the foreign prince was not being completely deceived by her. Noticing that he was still staying quiet, Akari directly asked him if something was wrong with him. Prince Hartknight then informed her that according to his father the king, his official engagement with Tiararose had been completely cancelled and annulled. As for the situation regarding Prince Aquasteed, he explained that he was still quite unsure of what was happening, but he did not believe that the two of them were formally or legally engaged to each other just yet. Hearing this news, Akari felt a great sense of relief and stated that she fully understood. Even so, she remarked that she had not expected things to turn out in this specific way, and she firmly insisted that Tiararose must have secretly gotten close to Prince Aquasteed a very long time before the party happened. Prince Hartknight then called out her name and directly asked her if the things Tiararose had said earlier during the public argument were actually true. Akari was completely taken aback by his sudden question and asked him exactly what he meant by that. In her mind, she vaguely recalled being warned very harshly by Tiararose and feeling deeply upset about it in the past, but she chose not to give him a clear or direct answer to his question. The prince simply responded to her lack of an answer by stating that he understood the situation. With bright and hopeful eyes, Akari told him that she had always had him right by her side through everything. She threw her arms around him to hug him tightly and stated that she knew she could always rely on him completely. However, Prince Hartknight did not return the embrace and instead gently pushed her away from his body. Feeling very surprised by his sudden rejection, Akari asked him if something was deeply troubling his mind and kindly offered to listen to him if he wanted to talk about it, urging him to tell her everything. The prince looked down at her with a very troubled facial expression and repeated that something was indeed bothering him a great deal. Akari then began to wonder if Lady Tiararose had said something specific to him to change his mind, and she quietly muttered to herself that it was highly unexpected for the story's villainess to interfere like this after the main story had already reached its end. Prince Hartknight replied to her suspicion by stating that he had not actually met or spoken to Tiararose since the party, explaining that he had only been thinking deeply about the things that had taken place at the graduation party. Akari repeated his words to herself, but found herself completely unsure of how she should respond to them. Instead, she expressed that she had not wanted things to end in this sad way either, and she deeply wanted to be together with him. She then asked him directly when the two of them would finally be allowed to be together out in the open. Prince Hartknight replied that it would not be happening for quite a while, explaining that she needed to wait a little bit longer even if the waiting would be very difficult for her. Akari begged him to hurry up the process, complaining that she really did not want to be left all alone in a single room anymore. Prince Hartknight gently held her face in his hands and told her that he would speak directly to his father the king that very night and then inform her of the final result, asking her to please endure the loneliness until then. Akari answered that she understood his request and would wait faithfully for his return. She also specifically asked him to tell the king all about Prince Aquasteed, explaining that she genuinely wanted to save and help the foreign prince before Lady Tiararose could do something absolutely terrible to him, just like what had supposedly happened to her own self. The prince could not understand the meaning behind her strange words at all, and he could only say her name out loud, in complete confusion. Prince Hartknight told Akari that she must be very tired from everything, tightly clenching his fist as he secretly wished that she would focus more on the serious situation they were currently facing. Instead of speaking his true mind out loud, he simply stated that he did not want to discuss that specific topic any longer. Even though he paused, as if he still had more to say, Akari waited expectantly for him to go on and softly called out his name. However, before he could say anything else, a soldier suddenly stepped into the room and announced that their time together was officially over. Filled with confusion, Akari reacted with great surprise to the sudden interruption. The prince apologized for being unfair and told her that he had to leave immediately, asking her to remain in the room a bit longer and to request help from the maid if she required anything at all. Clinging to him tightly, Akari begged him desperately not to walk away from her. He offered her a faint smile, but the guards quickly stepped between the two of them and firmly stated that it was a direct royal command. Speaking directly to the prince, the guard gave him another sharp reminder, and Prince Hartknight replied that he fully understood. He then walked over toward the exit door and assured Akari that he would eventually come back for her. She attempted to follow closely behind him, crying out for him to wait, but the soldier quickly blocked her path and kept her from moving forward. After some time had passed, Prince Hartknight and his father the king were sitting directly across from one another at a very long table. The king began the conversation by stating that he had already been informed about his son's secret visit to Lady Akari. Feeling quite surprised, Prince Hartknight quickly apologized for his selfish actions, but explained to his father that the meeting had been absolutely necessary for him. The king then noted that his son must have learned an important lesson from speaking with the young woman. Prince Hartknight openly admitted that he should have paid much more attention to the things Tiararose had told him in the past, but instead, he had foolishly believed every single word Akari told him. Clenching his fists tightly together, he confessed to his father that he did not even know how he could begin to apologize for his massive mistakes now. The king looked directly at his son and stated that although he had personally arranged the boy's engagement to Lady Tiararose when they were very young, the prince's recent terrible behavior was completely unworthy, not just for a member of the royal family, but also for any decent human being. Prince Hartknight completely agreed with his father's harsh words, finding himself struggling to speak from the sheer shame. He explained that after spending time with Akari, he had been forced to think very deeply about everything that had taken place. He noted that while Akari cared for him a great deal, Tiararose was a completely different kind of person. She truly understood the inner workings of the kingdom of Lapis Lazuli, as well as the distinct duties belonging to both high nobles and regular commoners. Because of this, he admitted his belief that she understood the future and the needs of other people far better than he himself ever did. The king strongly agreed with his son's realization, stating that Lady Tiararose had always perfectly understood her proper position as the daughter of a high marquis, and that was the exact reason why she had always supported Prince Hartknight so firmly through the years. The king then directly asked his son if his statement was incorrect in any way, and Prince Hartknight quickly replied that his father was not wrong at all. He continued by explaining that her strictness only showed just how truly important he had been to Tiararose, and he began to look back and remember all of their shared moments from the past. He recalled that at the very beginning of their relationship, both of them had been incredibly nervous, but she had gently held his hand to encourage him, stating that because they were facing the future together, they needed to remain strong for each other. She had always corrected his bad behavior whenever he tried to avoid his royal studies, scolding him by saying that it was completely wrong of him to cause trouble for his private teacher. She had constantly reminded him to stand up straight and hold himself properly because he was the crown prince, telling him that he absolutely needed to learn at least 3 different languages and even offering to help him study them herself. Furthermore, she had firmly reminded him that the royal knights strictly followed his royal orders, warning him that he must never misuse that immense authority just for his own personal benefit. After going through all of these powerful memories, Prince Hartknight told the king that he no longer believed the false accusations that Tiararose had ever harmed Akari. The king replied to this confession by stating that if his son was finally able to understand that truth now, it meant he had finally begun to grow up and mature as a person. However, the king quickly added that his severe mistakes were still not a light or simple matter to brush aside, and Prince Hartknight completely agreed, stating that he was fully prepared to accept whatever punishment his father decided to give him. The king could only let out a deep, heavy sigh at his son's words. Exactly 2 days after the dramatic events of the graduation party, Tiararose was seen walking carefully behind her father, who was following closely behind the king. Deep inside her own thoughts, she felt incredibly uneasy and nervous, wondering exactly why she and her father had been officially summoned by His Majesty the King, and why they were being led down into this specific place. She feared that perhaps the overall story of the game had shifted in a dangerous direction, and that she might actually be sent away to a dark prison, a terrifying thought that made her feel extremely anxious. Together, they walked past a very long line of painted portraits showing all the past kings of the land, with the current king's own portrait hanging proudly at the very far end of the hallway. The king made a quiet remark about the historical paintings, and the Marquis quickly responded that he was, of course, fully aware of their great meaning. The king then mentioned that Lady Tiararose had once visited that exact part of the castle together with Prince Hartknight. Tiararose confirmed that she had indeed been there before, remembering clearly that it happened when they were still young children around 10 years old. They had been officially engaged to each other since the tender age of 6, and by the time they turned 10, they had explored the grand castle together while holding hands with innocent curiosity. She vividly recalled how Prince Hartknight had playfully pulled her along to a specific restricted area while she desperately tried to stop him, reminding him that they needed proper permission to enter. He had confidently brushed off her worries, telling her that it was perfectly fine because he was a member of the royal family. He had then pointed directly at a large painting on the wall and called her full attention to it. It was a portrait of his own father, the king, and the young prince had proudly stated that one day his very own painted portrait would hang right beside it. Thinking back on that childhood memory, Tiararose felt that he had been incredibly cute and innocent at that time. The king then asked her if his son had been genuinely excited about the idea of having his portrait displayed in that special hallway, and Tiararose answered that the young prince had always spoken about His Majesty with immense love and pride. Hearing this, the king sighed very softly and murmured that he fully understood his son's past feelings. Then, looking closely at the grand wall, the king reached out to touch a completely empty space and firmly stated that Prince Hartknight's portrait would now never be placed there. Tiararose was deeply shocked by this action, suddenly realizing that this meant the prince's right to inherit the royal throne would be permanently taken away from him. The king then unexpectedly bowed his head deeply toward her and offered a sincere apology, expressing that his son had done something absolutely terrible to her at the party. Tiararose was incredibly surprised by this heavy royal gesture and quickly turned to look at her father for guidance, but he remained completely silent. In a sudden state of panic, she begged the king to please raise his head up, insisting that there was absolutely no need for a monarch to apologize to someone like her. The king replied that he was deeply grateful for her enduring kindness and explained that the royal palace had already thoroughly investigated the whole matter. He acknowledged that she had suffered and endured a great deal of public pain, expressing his deepest personal regret over how things were handled. Tiararose softly disagreed with his words, stating instead that she should have tried much harder to talk and communicate properly with Prince Hartknight to avoid the misunderstanding. The king responded by saying that the more he listened to her speak, the more he realized that she had always been far too good for his foolish son. Tiararose hesitated for a brief moment, but then gathered her courage to ask if the strict decision about the empty portrait space truly meant that Prince Hartknight would completely lose his birthright to the throne. The king firmly confirmed that it did mean exactly that, stating that Prince Hartknight was simply not worthy of holding such a high position anymore. Tiararose privately felt that the royal punishment was far too severe, noting to herself that both she and the prince were still only 16 years old and that he still had plenty of time left to grow up and mature as a person. She spoke out gently in his defense to the monarch, but the king only replied that she was far too kind because, even after everything that had taken place, she still worried about the boy's future. However, The monarch made it absolutely clear to her that this was his final decision as a ruler and that it would never change. Accepting his final answer, Tiararose bowed her head respectfully and stated that she understood the situation and would fully follow His Majesty's royal will. Inside her own thoughts, she knew it would be highly disrespectful to argue any further with the king, so she decided that she would simply ask her father later about any other official decisions that had been made regarding the family. The king then called her name softly and suddenly asked her what she honestly thought about Prince Aquasteed, offering a warm smile as he did so. Caught completely off guard by the question, Tiararose reacted in utter surprise, wondering to herself why the serious topic of conversation had changed so suddenly. Her father then spoke up for the first time, stating that he would completely respect her personal wishes on the matter, but he pointed out that Prince Aquasteed would soon have to return to his own home country, asking her how she truly felt about that departure. Tiararose immediately imagined Prince Aquasteed's gentle, handsome smile and answered that he was far too wonderful and good for someone like her to be with. Hearing her shy response, both the king and her father looked directly at her with playful, teasing expressions and openly concluded that she clearly did not dislike the foreign prince at all. Feeling incredibly embarrassed by their knowing looks, Tiararose thought to herself that the two older men seemed to be greatly enjoying her uncomfortable situation for some strange reason. The king then formally announced that her previous engagement with Prince Hartknight had been officially and completely annulled, and her father added to the news by stating that Prince Aquasteed had already submitted a highly formal request for her hand in marriage. Tiararose replied to them with confusion, noting that it usually took a full month of legal processing for a royal engagement to be completely annulled like that. The king then told her very honestly that he firmly believed Prince Aquasteed was a much better and more suitable match for her than Prince Hartknight could ever be. He added that Prince Aquasteed, who had bravely defended her honor at the graduation party, was an incredibly perceptive and smart man who would surely become a truly great king in the future. More than anything else, the king stated that Prince Aquasteed seemed to care deeply and genuinely for her well-being. Her father then told her that if she truly wished for it, the official marriage talks could move forward immediately, but he reassured her that he would never force her to make such a quick decision. He added that Prince Aquasteed himself had explicitly stated that he was completely willing to wait for her to be ready. Blushing even more intensely at his words, Tiararose thought to herself once again that the two older men were clearly enjoying this uncomfortable moment at her expense. She bowed her head respectfully and expressed her gratitude to the king for his deep concern, stating that she did not believe Prince Aquasteed would expect her to give her answer right away. Because of that, she decided that she would give her official response at another time in the future, a choice with which her father fully agreed. The king looked down at her with a very kind expression and stated that he sincerely wished for her true happiness, to which she gave a highly respectful reply. Even though she had not yet delivered her final answer, she felt a strong sense that she might eventually leave this home country that was ruled by such a remarkably kind king. When she finally returned to her family home, Tiararose laid down on the comfortable couch, feeling completely exhausted from the long night. Hugging a soft pillow tightly against her chest, she told herself that these intense events surely marked the official end of the game's story. She wondered silently if her daily life would now finally return to a normal routine. At the present moment, becoming Prince Aquasteed's bride seemed to be the most likely path for her future. However, she remembered that he was supposed to be the main love interest in the game's unreleased sequel, and she simply could not imagine a future where she would be the one chosen as his royal princess. Feeling completely overwhelmed by everything, she asked herself what she should do next, as there were simply far too many complicated things to think about all at once. When she imagined Prince Aquasteed's handsome and gentle smile, her heart began to beat incredibly quickly. She questioned what was truly happening to her feelings. She openly admitted to herself that she had been very excited when his character design was first introduced in her previous life, since he was exactly her favorite type of man. Thinking deeply about it made her feel a strong wave of nostalgia, and she wished once again that she had been able to actually play the sequel before her sudden death. The old memories of her past life living in Japan and her current life living as Tiararose felt very strange when mixed together, yet both lives felt completely real to her. As she thought more about the situation, she suddenly realized that the story's main heroine, Akari, also seemed to really like Prince Aquasteed. However, he was not supposed to be an official capture target in this specific game, so she could understand the reason behind Akari's behavior even less. She wondered if Akari simply liked any man who held a high position of authority, but she immediately rejected that unpleasant idea, telling herself that she absolutely did not want a game heroine to be that kind of person. Standing up from the couch, she decided that the best choice would be to just go to bed for the night. As she walked slowly toward her bedroom, she suddenly heard a quiet tapping sound coming from somewhere nearby. Looking around the room in confusion, She wondered what the strange noise could possibly be. Another sharp tap quickly followed the first one, and she suddenly realized that the sound was coming directly from her window. She questioned if someone outside was throwing small stones at her glass as a joke or a prank. Carefully moving forward, she peeked through the fabric of the curtain and was completely shocked by what she saw. It was Prince Aquasteed himself, standing right under a tree in the dark and waving up at her window with a smile.